Hello, friends. It's July 26th, 2024. It's quite a hot day today here in Germany. Don't really feel like working, actually, but you've sent me some extremely interesting questions, so I'm going to run through about 15 of them. So we'll start with number one. Do you think improvisation is central to the composition process? If so, how does a composer become a mature improviser? Well, it depends on the composer. It's central for some composers and it's peripheral or non-existent for others. Everybody has a different process. So there are composers, for example, who work exclusively at an instrument when they're composing. There are others who work primarily at a DAW or at music notation software of some kind. There are others who work at a desk. It really depends. There are some who are brilliant instrumentalists, virtuoso keyboardists or violinists or whatever. Others who barely touch an instrument. So no, it's not automatically central to anybody's process. I think it's an advantage. It's certainly a distinct advantage if you play an instrument, if you're a composer. And I would think it would be a considerable handicap not to have that skill. Although there are also examples in history of composers who have had few to no instrumental skills whatsoever and have still been extremely major creators. I don't think I need to rattle off the obvious examples. So it's possible, but I think in most cases, everything else being equal, I think it would be an advantage to be a skilled performer. So having a baseline level of competence on an instrument, I think would be necessary to improvise at anything other than the most rudimentary level. And with all things, if you want to be good at improvising, well, you have to work at that. It doesn't just happen automatically. Even if you're a highly trained classical cello player or whatever it might be, it doesn't automatically follow that you're going to be able to unleash your imagination in an effective manner when you're sitting down to improvise. Like there are lots of classical musicians, orchestral musicians who have no capacity to improvise whatsoever. So one other thing I would add to this is that when it comes to compositional materials and the way you go about your work, this is a very personal thing. It's not going to apply to everybody, but I know composers who cannot work without preparing extensive sketches beforehand. And they'll often, they'll work out the entire structure of a piece before they write a note of the score. They'll have all of their materials set up, before they start writing. So they know all the rhythms, what the harmonies are going to be. They have a very precise idea of the form and so on. I don't work like that. I've never been able to work like that. I find that completely impossible. So for me personally, if I'm working with materials that are so complex, so involved, what would you say? So dependent upon this kind of pre-compositional preparatory stage that it's impossible to improvise on my ideas because they would threaten to destabilize this whole complex web of materials, then I would find that to be an impossible situation. So I prefer to work with extremely simple materials that have that flexibility built into them so that if I wanted to, I could go over to a keyboard and improvise on those ideas without destroying them in the process. And for me, that's important. I'd like to just briefly jump in here and say that this channel exists because of the support that I receive on Patreon. If you are a regular listener and would like to see more of what I do, please consider becoming a patron at www.patreon.com/Samuel Andreyev. You'll find the link in the video or podcast description. You'll get exclusive previews, the ability to submit questions, CDs, signed prints, and more. But you can also support my work by subscribing to the channel, liking the videos, or joining in on the discussion through the comment section below. Number two, how did you handle or learn to handle negative feedback on pieces during the earlier stages of your music education? Are there any critiques from those years that you still think about today? Yeah, I received loads and loads of negative feedback on my pieces during the earlier stages of my music education, which is what you would expect, because when you're at the early stages of learning to be a composer or an instrumentalist or whatever it is, by definition, you're incompetent and you don't have any technique and you don't know what you're doing. So what you want is a teacher who's able to steer you in a productive direction without demolishing you and destroying your confidence every time you try to do something. So a good teacher will give you precise directions, and they will also sort of build walls around the projects that you're doing so that you're not faced with this cascading array of problems within problems within problems, which is what happens if you don't know what you're doing. So what you want is to be working on really, really specific small scale, manageable problems, one at a time, one after the other, rather than dealing with 100 problems at the same time. And you can very often tell when somebody has had minimal training or has been badly trained, because they're often trying to do way too much at the same time, and it's impossible. It's not a skill issue at that point. It's more like you're simply trying to do the impossible. So some of the feedback that I remember from those years, and it's not negative feedback, really. It's constructive criticism. It's a teacher attempting to tell you what you're missing and what you need to do to rectify that. And one thing that I did have trouble with for a number of years when I was starting out was planning the medium term, let's say, flow of a piece. So in other words, I was good at writing little sections of pieces and things like that. And I had no trouble coming up with materials and melodies and interesting harmonies and so on. But I had trouble building those into a coherent continuity. And so a lot of the feedback that I received and the criticism that I received at that time had to do with, learning how to imagine a piece as a continuity. How do you get from one event to the next? How do you build tension over the course of a piece? And I still remember that to this day. Absolutely. Number 3, where do you draw the line between inspiration and being derivative? That's a problem that comes up quite often in my private teaching practice. And it's not surprising. This is not a new problem, incidentally. This is something composers and creative people have had to deal with for basically forever, because in order to piece together a functioning technique, you need to imitate things that people have done in the past. You can't simply form your own technique out of nowhere. There are some limit cases, I'll admit, of artists who have done that, who have been basically completely untrained and have sort of pieced together their own technique. And okay, in some very, very exceptional instances, that works. But most of the time, you should assume that the most effective path forward is to learn a body of techniques, learn about what people have done in the past, try to get good at those things, and then through that process, eventually discover the things that resonate the most with you and try to discover your own personality within that. Now, that can go too far at times, clearly. And I've certainly encountered many instances of students, but also, for that matter, professional composers who have taken essentially the property of somebody else and used that as a springboard for their own career. And the point at which you can say it's going too far is if you can actually recognize not just stylistic quirks here and there, but entire chunks of pieces or gestures or materials from pieces that they did not write. And you can recognize them in a relatively straightforward and untransformed manner. And that is, of course, a huge issue. I mean, that's effectively plagiarism at that point. So if the materials are recognizable from another context and they haven't been sufficiently transformed, in other words, you haven't made them your own, then yes, that's an issue, and that's something that would need to be addressed immediately. Absolutely. We're all constantly drawing inspiration from things that other people have done, though. I mean, that's not only is it impossible to avoid, there's no reason to avoid doing it unless we want to each speak our own private dialect effectively and not have any common basis for communication whatsoever. So you can think of art, you can think of the history of music as like a giant palimpsest where everybody is adding their own notation to this gigantic work that's being created by humanity collectively. And that's the way I would view it. But you want to make sure that you are transforming what's already been done such that not only are you producing something distinctive, something that is truly yours, and you're not simply, repeating other people's words, because, when that happens, you're corrupting the language. You're basically producing things that, they're not, well, not only are they not authentic, but they're inevitably worse than the things that you're copying, right? So we don't want that. We want language to be reinvigorated, to be transformed, and to be, to work with an eye towards the potential that has not yet been realized within the world of music. And I think that potential is limitless. Does modernism still mean anything to you at this stage in history? Well, yes, it's not because we're in 2024 that the meaning of modernism no longer applies. I mean, I think most musicians and musicologists and historians and, would have no trouble settling upon a common definition of what modernism means, what the attitudes are that resulted in it, and what modernist artworks look like by and large in their basic philosophical attitude, let's say. But I think the implication in your question is something like, does modernism still have real currency today? And the answer to that is yes, clearly, because we're still living in that era where the achievements of the modernist artists are very clearly present. You see them everywhere. You see them in popular culture, in high culture, and everywhere in between. You see it from the top to the bottom of our culture, in fact, in terms of the basic values and attitudes that are reflected by a lot of the art and the culture that surrounds us, then very clearly so. And the question then is really, what exactly is modernism? If you're going to try to have an argument about whether or not it's present, you'd have to make the effort to define that. What I've noticed also is that there are a lot of online commentators that, for one reason or another, whether it's deliberate malice or ignorance, I'm not sure, but they lump everything into the category of postmodernism without really understanding exactly what that means. And so there's a lot of modernist works that get described as postmodern, which, well, it's annoying because there's a difference between those two things. It's not the same attitude whatsoever. So modernism, for me, the primary thing about modernism is, first of all, it's an extension of Romanticism. I mean, it has a lot in common with Romanticism. That's the first thing. It's really an extension and intensification of the Romantic attitude, which tends to emphasize individuality. It tends to be more interested in what hasn't been done than what already has been done. It's trying to move forward. There's an attitude of progress also within the modernist stance that I think is very clear. In other words, the things that we're doing today are in some manner better than or going farther than the things that were done previously. So I think all of those attitudes completely permeate our culture. Absolutely. Number 5, do you think people can study music professionally without going to music school or conservatories? Yes, I think it's possible. It's difficult, though. And, well, I think it's inevitable that we will be moving towards that kind of a model ultimately, because there's a lot about the current programs on offer from music conservatories and universities that is substandard, let's say, or not optimal exactly. And a lot of people, I mean, this is clear to me by the number of people that approach me for private lessons, and also a lot of the public lecturing that I've been doing. There's a lot of people who have no interest in going to university or to a conservatory, but they still want to pursue music at a high level. So I think it's important that the wishes of those people be addressed, and that there be structures in place that make it possible to study music at a professional level without necessarily going to one of these schools. So we can debate about the advantages and disadvantages of both approaches. I mean, clearly, one huge advantage of going to university is accreditation. The other is the social prospects that can come about from being in a group of your peers for a number of years, and also the fact that it gives you a framework within which to exist, right? That is extremely important for people, especially when they're young. So it's possible. Right now, it's probably, for most people, it's probably preferable to go to a conservatory if you can. But then again, it depends a lot on where you live. If you don't have the capacity to move to a different city, if you're in a small town somewhere, if you, if it's difficult for you to travel and there isn't a good school nearby, then that might be a real issue for you. And my hope is that for those people, and for anybody who, for whatever reason, doesn't think it's a good option for them to go to university, then I would hope that the internet would make things a lot more interesting for them. Number 6, do you think isms are important to music in the 21st century, or do you think it's more important to approach it democratically / individually? I think it's definitely very difficult to go it alone as an artist. What I mean is, if you are working in a direction that is really singular, that no one else is moving in, or that runs counter to prevailing trends in the music world or the art world, then yes, things are going to be harder for you. But here's the thing. You don't necessarily get to choose what you're compelled by and what it is that you want to focus on, right? So it's not as though you can just arbitrarily say, well, I'm going to work in this direction because it's advantageous to my career. It's like the work that you do is related to both what it is that you urgently need to say, and that to a degree, you don't get to choose what that is. It's like, I think we all have things that we need to say, creative types anyway. And once you've identified that, it might align with what other people are doing and it might not. But if you're going to have a robust and vital creative practice, then I would think you would want to remain faithful to that at a minimum. So yeah, it's harder to go against the crowd. There's no question. And it can be advantageous to work in a direction that lots of other people are going in because there's strength in numbers and you can support each other mutually, and it's easier to package. It's easier to describe also. If you can use a few key words to describe the artwork, then it's easier for artistic directors. It's easier for programming decisions. Yeah, it does make things easier. But so what? It's like you have to make the work that you think is important and that is uniquely yours to make, and come what may. Number 7, does a composer who doesn't play a given instrument but possesses specialized knowledge of it, the Stravinsky case, for example, when composing his violin concerto, visualize in his imagination or at least have a detailed sense of the exact fingering necessary? Can a string instrument composition have random or counterintuitive fingerings in the sense of a composer not caring for the technical aspects, but just the timbre capabilities of it? That's actually a really interesting question. So you mentioned the Stravinsky violin concerto. So Stravinsky didn't have a very detailed understanding of the violin at all when he wrote that piece. And this is something that comes up in his correspondence, actually, when he was beginning to write the piece. He was actually very concerned about that and somewhat hesitant to take on the commission for that reason. So a lot of the violin concertos of the past were written by violinists who obviously knew the instrument inside and out, and therefore could write things that only a skilled virtuoso would know about. The violin writing in the Stravinsky concerto is quite simple most of the time. It's very, very rudimentary. For me, it's not a problem, really. It doesn't harm the piece in any way, but it's just a simple fact about the piece. So as for whether you can allow yourself to write random or counterintuitive fingerings when writing for strings, that is definitely not okay. That's a very bad idea. Because, look, humans have a certain morphology that is, approximately equivalent from violinist to violinist, right? So you're not going to find someone whose fingers are 3 times as long as the average person's fingers. And there are limitations to what kind of stretches you can do, what kind of positions you can do, at different with different hand positions on the fingerboard of a violin or a cello. Those are just real physiological limitations, and you need to have some sense of what those are, I think, in order to be able to write effectively for the instrument. And I see this all the time in the work of students who are writing for string instruments for the first time, or not, maybe not even for the first time, but they've just never bothered to learn. They write intervals that are extremely difficult to play on instruments. They're difficult to play in tune, huge stretches that are completely impossible, double and triple stops that can't be played, and the results are just extremely awkward or unplayable. And then you have to spend half of the time in the rehearsal with the player finding alternatives because it just doesn't work. Like it's always, I think, to your advantage to write things that are reasonably idiomatic. It just sounds better. There's a reason why classical and Baroque violin concertos are almost always in G major or D major. It's like the instrument sounds better. It resonates more. You can use the open strings. The fingerings are easier, and so on and so forth. Of course, like violinists can play in E flat. You could also have a violin concerto in E flat major, but the instrument just wouldn't resonate in the same way. So anyway, yeah, no, definitely having some at least basic rudimentary understanding of the fingerings and the ergonomic possibilities of instruments, I think is a real advantage. The other thing that I would add about that is there are things that sound and look on paper to be extraordinarily difficult, but are not really. And the reason is that the composer knows the instrument so well that they're thinking in terms of gestures, and the gestures might be totally fluid and idiomatic and very natural. So here's an example of that. The C major etude by Chopin, I think it's Opus 10, the waterfall piece, looks incredibly impressive when you see a virtuoso playing that piece. But The whole thing is, Chopin was obviously a virtuoso pianist, and he was thinking in terms of gestures, and the gestures are totally fluid and natural. There's nothing torturous about it when you play that piece. Not that I can play it, by the way, but I've spoken with pianists who can play it extremely well, and they've all said, it's not a huge problem. It sounds a lot harder than it is. So, knowing an instrument really well can also allow you to do things that sound incredible while still sticking with the basic parameters of the instrument, and performers love that, by the way. It's like performers really hate working on pieces that are a huge amount of work, are incredibly awkward, and that don't sound very good. It's like, that's not motivating. So it's a Darwinian advantage to you as a composer if you can write things that sound good, that are effectively written for the instrument, and everyone will be happier in that scenario most of the time. Number 8, could you recommend a book on writing for strings for real players? I can't recommend such a book, although they do exist, and the reason is nothing can replace working with an actual performer. It's impossible. I could show you a book with charts of fingerings and so on, and you could learn some things from that, but honestly, like a dedicated half hour with a player who's just showing you, okay, here's the first position, here's the second position, here's what you need to do to play an octave double stop, here's what a sixth looks like, here's what a perfect fourth looks like, and so on. Like, you can just see it, and you can learn really quickly what's possible and what's not possible. Here's what intonation looks like when you're way up high on the E string of the violin, for example. Here's how tiny the intervals are. And like stuff like that, it's like you can't replace that very easily. So yeah, like a half hour with a real violinist, and just find someone who plays a string instrument. It's not that uncommon. Tons of people play these instruments. Find someone, bug them, ask for half an hour of their time, buy them lunch or whatever. That'll be more valuable than any book you could buy. Number 9, have you ever had someone point out an aspect of your work that you yourself hadn't noticed? Similarly, have you ever had delayed insights into your own compositions long after you finished writing them? Yeah, all the time. And that's what you would expect. So when I read criticism of my work, or when musicologists write about it, or whatever articles are written about my work, I'm always surprised. And I would be dismayed if there was no element of surprise whatsoever, because that would indicate that they were merely restating my own thoughts about my work, which I don't see any point in that whatsoever. That's not musicology. That's basically, if somebody writes an article just restating the composer's own opinions about their work, then that's basically thinly veiled promotional writing. It's not actual, it's not actual critical writing. So yeah, every time someone's written something about my work, I've thought, okay. And I have to accept that, it's like, it's not going to be the same as what I imagined, but that's how it goes. It's like you make the thing, and then it's up to other people to determine what they think of it. Now, as for the second part of your question, have I ever had delayed insights into my compositions? I have no insights into my compositions when I'm working on them. I literally have no idea what I'm doing at that stage. It's like, imagine that you're blindfolded with your hands tied behind your back, and you're trying to swim, and it's 2 a.m. and there's no light. And it's like, that's what the composition process is like for me, where you're trying to get your bearings in a totally alien space. And there are only a few basic things that you have to sort of help you get oriented and to survive in that scenario. And that's actually the way I like it. I don't want to be in a situation where I know exactly what I'm going to do ahead of time, and I have an array of techniques that I can just sort of blindly draw upon whenever I'm making something. Rather, I like to be in a situation where I don't exactly know where I am, and I have to react in the moment and make decisions, in this very sort of heated manner. That's way more interesting to me. So in that sense, I don't understand my pieces when I'm writing them. I don't understand them afterwards. Maybe after 5 or 10 years have gone by, I can kind of look at it with a certain distance and say, oh yeah, that's what I was doing then. But certainly in the moment, no, I don't know what I'm doing, and I can't evaluate it. I don't know if it's good or not. But the process is more important to me than the final thing. And I think that's right. If you're really focused on making a good piece at all costs, and the process can become really unpleasant at that stage, because there's this thing in psychology called hyper-intention. It's like these people who have trouble sleeping, insomniacs. And often it's because they're they're so obsessed, they're so focused on the idea of falling asleep that they get all tense about it, and then it makes it even harder to sleep. And I feel that way about artists who are desperately concerned with, making a masterpiece or whatever. It has to be a great score. It's like you can't just will that. You have to enjoy the process, and then if a good piece comes out of that, then that's a byproduct. But and obviously, you want to do a good job, and you want to always take your art to a higher level. But you've got to foreground the process, I believe. Number 10, I am a double bass player. Good for you. I love the double bass. And I've noticed that you composed a solo piece for the instrument. Where can I buy the score? What was the inspiration for this piece? And what is the process of composing a solo piece for an instrument you don't play? Oh, well, I can answer that really quickly. So yes, I have a piece for double bass called Lighting Up. I wrote it a while back, actually, I think in 2016. And it's been played by a bunch of double bass players. There's a recording that you can find on Spotify. A Spanish bassist, I believe he was Spanish, recorded the piece for a solo CD. The inspiration for the piece, I'm trying to remember now. I don't think it was a commission, actually. I think that was a piece that I wanted to write myself because I love the double bass. And I took a bit of time to write that. The process of composing for an instrument I don't play, well, it was challenging. I did a lot of research, actually, about the double bass. And I went and bugged a whole bunch of double bass players. And I had the piece read through by a number of bassists before the premiere, and even after the premiere, I still kept on working with different performers on the score because it's quite convoluted. There's a lot of microtones in that piece, a lot of harmonics, a lot of triple stops and things like that. So it was technically difficult to work all of that stuff out, but I'm really happy with the piece as it exists. It's really, really hard to play. And you can buy that from my publisher, Edition Impronta, Impronta. They publish all my scores. You can just find them on Google, and the piece is called Lighting Up. Number 11, do you have to know music theory to appreciate 20th century avant-garde music, or is sensitivity to music enough? It's got to be enough. Otherwise, there's a problem with the work. That's my position on that. Curiosity is probably required because a lot of 20th century music is... What would you say? Well, there's such a huge wealth of different styles and stylistic directions in the music of the 20th century that if you only want to stay very close to a very particular style, then you might find that challenging. So cultivating an attitude of openness and curiosity towards that work will help. But no, I mean, if you need to study music theory or musicology to appreciate a work and otherwise it reveals nothing to you, then there's probably something deficient about the work, and that's not on you. Number 12, is it important to learn compositional skills like ear training and harmony to prepare for studying composition at a university? And how much knowledge and experience should you have if you want to study composition before going to music school? Well, that's an interesting question. So there's a bit of a difference there between North American students and European ones, and I can comment on this because I'm European now. I live in Europe. I've been here for more than 20 years, but I'm also from North America originally. So typically undergraduate students in American universities have very little to no prior experience with a lot of the basic technical parameters of composition when they start studying music. So for example, they might have to take a series of required courses on like introduction to sight singing, introduction to harmony, introduction to counterpoint, and so on and so forth, with the assumption that they'll have very little or no prior experience with those subjects. So that's at an undergraduate level. Now, in my experience, the gifted students, usually learn those things quite quickly. So even though they might be getting to it a little bit later than European students, they can typically catch up. It's not really a huge big deal. The difference in Europe is that there's a developed network of often quite high-level music schools that are available not just to people aiming to become professionals, but to the general public. And so kids often start learning music at a much earlier age simply because there are so many schools. In Italy, there's like, I can't remember the exact number, but there's something like 90 to 100 conservatories, at a very high professional level in the country. So whatever region you live in, you're likely to be relatively close to one of those schools. So I suppose there's a bit of an advantage there because Europeans often learn solfege and music writing and theory earlier than North American students. But again, talent is a great equalizer. And even if you learn these things slightly later, I don't think it's a huge handicap for really gifted students. Number 13, why does it seem to be that Western European contemporary music still ignores musical traditions from Africa, particularly those cultures in West Africa? Do you think these musical traditions can be compatible? Well, I don't know what you mean by contemporary exactly, but in terms of post-war avant-garde composers, I mean, the Europeans of the generation born in the 1920s were obsessed with world music, absolutely obsessed with it. I mean, Boulez, Stockhausen, Ligeti, Xenakis, Nono, Berio, they were all very curious about and very knowledgeable about the music of Bali, music of sub-Saharan Africa, Carnatic music, and so on and so forth. And in many instances, you see that influence very directly in their music. I don't know specifically about the music of West Africa, but certainly the composer Ligeti was very, very interested in African polyphony and African rhythms, and you can see that in a lot of his music, particularly his later scores. As for today, I don't know. I have no idea if the students of today or the composers of today are interested or not interested in the music of West Africa. I think there are lots of people who are curious about all sorts of things, and others who prefer to stay closer to the tradition that they were born within and that they are more familiar with. So I don't know what else I can say. Number 14, what needs to change for new classical music to rise in popularity? And do you also think it's the fault of the music and the composers themselves, alongside many other factors? Well, the assumption in your question is that new classical music is not sufficiently popular and that this is a problem. I would take a slightly different approach to this question and say that I think that the amount of popularity that it has is absolutely coherent with the nature of most of the work being done, right? So a lot of, actually, let's be clear, the vast majority of contemporary musical composition is of little to no interest to the broader public. And there's no particular reason why that should change either, right? Because it's not really for them. So if you go to festivals of contemporary music, or even not just festivals, but just like ordinary sort of everyday concerts where new works are being premiered, very often you'll see that the audience consists of professionals, right? So composers writing new pieces, and then there are composers in the audience and performers, and then the friends of those people, and then maybe some industry insiders. A lot of the events have that characteristic. Not all, obviously there are some exceptions, but broadly speaking, I find that that's very often the case. And I'm just not interested in those kinds of audiences. It's fine. I'm nothing against it, but I almost don't consider that to be a real audience at all. It's like a professional convention at that point. It's like when a bunch of engineers get together and talk about engineering stuff. It's kind of on that level. So I'm not sure who these people are writing for. I'm not sure that they're even necessarily interested in having an audience outside of that. I think the circle of concern of a lot of contemporary artists extends not much farther than the tip of their nose. Quite honestly, they're thinking about their own professional prospects and where their next commission is going to come from and whether their piece was well played or badly played and that kind of thing. But I don't think they're necessarily all that concerned about what connecting with a broader audience outside of that. Some of them are, to be fair, but if you're really interested in that and in connecting with people, then a concert of contemporary composition is not the showcase for your work. Do anything else, like put your stuff on YouTube, organize concerts yourself, whatever. But the existing infrastructure for new music is not the place to go if you want to have any kind of cultural impact. That's for sure. So yeah, there's my answer. Number 15, you talk often about the lack of contemporary sounding music, both in pop and the classical world. Although I can think of a fair number of musicians who are working in distinctly 21st century sounds, I struggle with this myself. How does one create something that sounds contemporary? Well, the surest way to make something that doesn't sound contemporary is to be obsessed with making something that sounds contemporary. What can I say? I think what you need to do is focus on figuring out, what is really yours? What are the things that really resonate with you that you can transfigure, that you can transform, where you have a distinctive way of handling material, and try to determine, what are the things that are actually other people's materials, other people's thoughts, other people's responses to their particular historical circumstances that you're kind of imitating, and try to get rid of all that stuff because it's just crowding out your own, your own particularities, the unique gifts that you have to share with the world. And that's a very painful and difficult and awkward process, right? Because what you'll discover as you start really paying attention to that is that most of what you're writing isn't yours at all. It's the semi-digested creative products of other people that you're kind of cobbling together into your own thing. That's a necessary stage. Everybody goes through it. But once you get out of your student years, it's a reasonable expectation that you will have found something that is a little bit more distinctive. And, it might be that there's just like there's like 2% of what you're doing that's yours. It's going to be, just very, very little. But what you do is you focus on that, and it expands and grows, and you throw off all of the things that are you unconsciously trying to please your teachers or trying to please what you think audiences are interested in, and you get rid of all that stuff and focus on what you're doing. And I think that is the pathway to making something really contemporary, because you live today, right? That's just a simple fact. It's like you can't live in 1970 or 1945 or whatever. It's impossible. So you're condemned to live in the present moment, and because the present moment is unique, and because there are forces operating around you that have never existed before, and at least not in that particular configuration, then of necessity, I think if you're really listening, if you're really being attentive to what it is that you have to say, then whatever you do will have the quality of being contemporary. As long as you don't make the mistake of thinking that contemporary equals something that is radically new. I don't think we're in that paradigm anymore. That was a thing in the post-war era where composers were expected, as a matter of course, to make things that sounded astonishingly novel every single time. But that's you can't keep that up indefinitely, and it's not the basis for a thriving musical culture anyway. So, yeah, focus on what is really yours, what is authentic, develop that, make it grow, and try to just shake off the things that are the conscious or unconscious rehashings of other people's creative efforts. That's it for today. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you want to support this channel and the work that I'm doing, you can also support me on Patreon, and you'll find a link in the video description. Thanks again for watching. See you next time.